thank you all for coming on such a miserable day. I promise to leave you, I don't promise anything. I probably will leave you in a mood as gray as the weather outside, but I will do my best to alleviate it a little bit. It gives me enormous pleasure to have the honor of delivering the 10th annual Eqbal Ahmad Lecture at Hampshire College. The reason for my pleasure is obvious. The last time I saw my dear friend Eqbal was here at Hampshire College, where, as you know, he taught for 15 years. Simply being here gives me another occasion to remember this gentle and wonderful man. Doing so in an event that honors him and his legacy gives me even greater pleasure. However, being here on this occasion also causes me sadness. I'm saddened because Eqbal Ahmad is no longer among us with his calm, wise voice. You had to have heard him to understand how extraordinary his voice was. I'm even more saddened because so very much of what he warned us about, so many of the evils he described and analyzed have come to pass and are still around us. I'll speak to some of these phenomena in my talk. And at this stage, I have to issue an apology. Edward Said said to me, never apologize to an audience. But I sometimes don't do what Edward said. And I'm going to apologize to you because I'm advertised as giving you a talk on the Cold War and the new Cold War in the Middle East, and that is what I was going to talk to you about. It's the subject of a book I'm working on, and it's the subject of 3 lectures I just delivered at Bryn Mawr, and I was prepared to come up here and talk about that. But your dean sent me an email in which he said some of the students are asking the question, what would Eqbal have said about the situation in Pakistan? And that started me thinking. And so I threw away what I was going to say, and I'm going to give you a completely different talk. Sometimes it pays to apologize. I first met Eqbal Ahmad in New York City and in Chicago in 1969 or 1970. I don't remember. But I really got to know him in Beirut, where I was living in the 70s and early 80s. He came to visit Beirut together with his very close friend Edward Said many times, and it was really there that I first had a chance to know this remarkable individual. Eqbal was undoubtedly, I met many people in my life. I could tell you some of them and you'd perhaps be surprised, but Eqbal was undoubtedly the most worldly and urbane person I had ever met, and at the same time, perhaps the most down-to-earth. In those days, back in the 60s and 70s when I first met him, some of us had read Frantz Fanon. Eqbal Ahmad had worked with Fanon in Tunisia and Algeria, in the FLN, in the National Liberation Front. Some of us had read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Perhaps some of you may have seen the film. Eqbal knew Malcolm X well. Indeed, he was the one who invited Malcolm to lecture at Princeton, the first non-black institution at which Malcolm X ever spoke. A few of us may have read something about Mahatma Gandhi. Some of you may have seen the film. Eqbal Ahmad traveled across India with the Mahatma for 12 weeks when Eqbal was 12 years, for 6 weeks when Eqbal was 12 years old. Some of us had demonstrated against the war crimes of Henry Kissinger in Southeast Asia back in the day. In 1972, Eqbal was accused, together with other good people, of trying to kidnap Henry Kissinger and was acquitted, I might ask. Actually, the judge declared a mistrial. Eqbal truly knew whereof he spoke, and he always spoke with an extraordinary quiet authority that drew on these and many other experiences that in combination were absolutely unique to him. One of my greatest regrets is that it was only after his untimely death in 1999 that I truly came to appreciate this man, his eloquence, his brilliance, and his sagacity. Before that, while I never ever took him for granted, while I always marveled at his words and at his wisdom, I guess I assumed he would always be there and that he would always be a resource for all of us. Now, we are reduced to his words on paper, to his many marvelous interviews, to his articles embodied in this wonderful volume, which you should all buy. and to memories of his extraordinary impact on a room full of people. I recall, like it was yesterday, a brief talk Iqbal was induced to give here at Hampshire, maybe 12 years ago. I don't remember exactly when it was. I spent half an hour last night trying to figure out when this was. It was a conference on globalization, which was then still a new and trendy concept. Imagine that. Those invited, the good and the great, of course, gave papers that were without exception articulate and intelligent. In other words, it was a better conference than most in that respect. Then Eqbal Ahmad, the sage of Hampshire College, got up in his very modest way, against his will. He was induced to give up and give a short talk. And after he'd finished, I realized that in a very few words, he had said more about globalization than all of us had in all of our papers. He talked very simply about his experience of trying to establish a university in Pakistan, which he called Khaldunia. It was named, as you may know, for the great 14th century Arab historian, political theorist, the founder of sociology, Ibn Khaldun, by simply describing what globalization meant in real terms, insofar as the impoverishment of knowledge production in one country, Pakistan, was concerned, simply by describing the role of the World Bank, USAID, and the corrupt Pakistani elite in the steady degradation of the intellectual capacities of the Pakistani people, and by subtly linking this incident to wider issues. Eqbal Ahmad probably taught us more about the realities of globalization than anything else we learned at this very, very good conference. Now, this brings me to why Eqbal was so very prescient, was so very perceptive, was so very accurate in so much of what he said and wrote about the world. It was not just his natural intelligence. It wasn't just his quiet eloquence or his dry wit. It was not just his wide reading in a staggering array of different genres of writing on diverse subjects. I knew only one person, maybe two, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, who read more widely than Eqbal. And by widely, I mean everything. He read everything. All of this was part of it, but many people are intelligent or articulate or widely read. It was that in addition to all of this, Eqbal Ahmad had lived his life not just in the academy, not just at Princeton and Chicago and Cornell and Hampshire, but also in the world. For much of his life, he had been deeply engaged in real politics and in real activism. He had always been unimpressed by material things, and he had always been repelled by the lure of power. These characteristics gave him a down-to-earth, common-sense wisdom, which came as much from his broad and varied life experiences as it came from his brilliant intellectual trajectory. The last thing I want to say in explaining the power of his writings and his speeches is at the same time that Eqbal was a teacher and a scholar, an intellectual and an activist, he also had a profound appreciation and love of literature and the arts, and especially of Urdu poetry. He had an understanding of things, in other words, that came not just from book learning and not just from involvement in action-filled practical politics, but also from the deep philosophical insight he drew from poetry, from Sufi mysticism, from Islamic classical sources, and from popular culture. These are all reasons why he spoke so eloquently, why those of us who knew him miss him so much, and why he still speaks to us through his writings 9 years after his passing. Now, this brings me to the main part of my talk tonight, or this afternoon. So it seems like night. It's so dark in here. What would Eqbal Ahmad have said about Pakistan? I was asked in an email from the dean as I prepared this lecture, and this is what caused me to change what I was going to say. What would Eqbal have said about the current situation in Pakistan? And I thought to myself, what would he have said about Afghanistan? What would he have said about Iraq? What would he have said about Palestine? What would he have said about the inexorable drive of leading figures in the Bush administration for yet another war, this time in Iran? Of course, I cannot know, you cannot know, we cannot know with any assurance what Eqbal would have said. But we can look at these terrible crises, We can look at these terrible results of old colonial wounds, of the self-inflicted wounds caused by post-independence elites, and at the gaping wounds resulting from the new neoconservative, neo-imperialist hubris in Washington. We can look at these things, and we can imagine what he might have said. We have much to go on in doing so. We have his published words, the record of his wisdom and foresight. In addition, a few of us are fortunate enough to have the memory of his spoken words, his gentle laugh, his sharp, penetrating intelligence, his rapier-like sense for the heart of the matter, his distaste for power. He hated power. He hated people who had power. And he didn't like the powerful either. And his sympathetic understanding for the underdogged, the deprived, and the vulnerable. So, what might Eqbal have had to say to us about Pakistan? Well, we can deduce from what he wrote about Pakistan some of the things he might well have said. Surely, he would have been coruscating in describing the awful General Pervez Musharraf and his military regime. We know this from his acid-limbed descriptions of the chain of mustachioed generals from Ayub Khan to Zia-ul-Haq, who previously misruled Pakistan and stifled democracy with the steadfast support, always with the steadfast support of the United States, which once upon a time was mesmerized by the Cold War and is now obsessed by Islam. He properly blamed Zia-ul-Haq for many things, in particular, in his writings, that is, in particular for the mobilization of political Islam as a prop for his regime's tyranny. About the political misuses of Islam, Eqbal Ahmad was unequivocal. He said, and I'm now quoting from something he said in an interview with David Barsamian. I'm quoting, "Islam has been, in Pakistan and also in other Muslim countries, a refuge for weak and scoundrel regimes and rulers in modern times. Whenever they feel threatened and isolated and are losing their grip, losing popularity, losing the consensus of the people, they bring out Islam from the closet and use it as a political weapon." This is a brilliant diagnosis. This, of course, was a description specifically of the Nawaz Sharif government that succeeded that of Benazir Bhutto. But it could just as well be a description of the dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq that preceded these two governments, or that of Pervez Musharraf that succeeded them. For that matter, it could be a description, or could have been a description of the Sadat government in Egypt, could have been a description of the current Iranian regime, or of many other politically bankrupt regimes in the Arab and Islamic worlds. If, as Samuel Johnson said, patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, then Iqbal's description is all the more true of the toxic mixture of nationalist jingoism and religion that drives many of these regimes and many other Islamist political formations. What else might Eqbal Ahmad have said about Pakistan? He would undoubtedly have been scathing about what, echoing Frantz Fanon, he called the pitfalls of nationalism, and about the emergence of a collaborative elite, collaborating, in other words, with foreign powers, as is described in the last chapter of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which incidentally Fanon was writing in the very period when he was collaborating, when Iqbal was collaborating with him. These elites, these collaborative elites, as Fanon calls them, have battened like vultures on their country's wealth. And this is something that, in fact, Iqbal wrote about in many contexts. He would certainly have warned us against trusting in politicians like Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto, whom he said in an interview, again with David Barsamian, had stolen nearly $2 billion in under 4 years in power, and incidentally, whose corrupt husband, Asif Zardari, later took back the land that Bhutto had grudgingly granted Iqbal for the Khaldunia University. He took it back in order to build a golf course, apparently. So, there we are. University, golf course. Finally, Iqbal would have spoken very clearly about an issue that affects not just Pakistan, but Afghanistan, the Middle East, and many other parts of the globe. This is covert American support for some of the most unsavory forces in societies and governments the world over, as part of whatever crusade American policymakers happen to be engaged in at a given moment. Once upon a time, it was a crusade against the evil empire, which for those of you too young to remember, was what President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union, a country which you may not remember ceased to exist in 1991 when some of you perhaps were not yet in elementary school. There was once a country called the Soviet Union, and we had a president once who called it the evil empire. This crusade, which Ronald Reagan led, took the United States into Afghanistan after the Soviets committed the criminal folly of invading that country in December 1979. United States intervention in Afghanistan was entirely covert. It was carried out through our intelligence services and those of allies like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, who together supported the resistance of the Afghan Mujahideen to the Soviet occupation. Though a casual viewing and reading of our miserable media would not tell you this, this intervention, this covert intervention, back in the late 70s and 80s, is the source of many of our most serious troubles today in these three countries, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, and in several others. Because the folks that our intelligence services were dealing with were financing, were arming, were training, were coddling in Afghanistan and in Pakistan in the 80s, thereafter metastasized into the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. Those were our boys. Let me remind those of you too young to remember, and those of you who may be old enough but may have forgotten, that in 1986, Ronald Reagan received a delegation of these guys in the White House, a bunch of Mujahideen leaders, and he proceeded to call them the moral equivalents of our founding fathers. These people who are blowing up Afghan civilians who happen to be aligned with the pro-Soviet government. Some of these same individuals, like, for example, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, today, even as I speak, command forces that are fighting American troops in Afghanistan. The military regime that is tottering in Pakistan today, crumbling as we speak, is the heir of the generals who served American ends and served their own objectives in supporting and controlling these Islamist forces in Afghanistan and northwest Pakistan. This regime, this same regime, and its intelligence service, the ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence of the Pakistani Armed Forces, are the same pleasant fellows responsible for the AQ Khan network, which engaged in selling nuclear know-how and material to Libya, North Korea, Iran, maybe other countries. The most extensive episode of nuclear proliferation since Soviet spies penetrated the American nuclear establishment more than 60 years ago. We know more or less what Eqbal Ahmad would have said about some of these things because tragically, the situation has only changed for the worse in these three countries since his death in 1999. And he wrote and spoke on these matters extensively and with passion. He understood in the mid-90s perfectly where this was taking us. He saw it as I see you before me today. Speaking in Boulder, Colorado in 1998, 3 years before 9/11, Iqbal presciently warned us of the dangers to come. He was speaking specifically about Osama bin Laden, whom he had met about 10 years earlier in Pakistan, and whose measure he had taken at that time. He understood what he was talking about. And I'm going to quote him at length. This is, I think, important. This is Iqbal now. What is my recommendation to America? Please eschew, please avoid covert operations and low-intensity warfare. These are the breeding grounds of terror and drugs. Violence and drugs are bred there by the structure of covert operations. I skip a long passage where he illustrates this dictum, that covert operations and low-intensity warfare are the breeding grounds of terror and drugs. He goes on to say, I went to see Osama bin Laden. Somebody from the CIA said, this is the man you want to meet. I went to see Osama. There he was, rich, bringing in recruits from Algeria, from Sudan, from Egypt. This fellow was an ally. He remained an ally. He turns, means an ally in this Afghan jihad. He turns at a particular moment in 1990 when the US goes into Saudi Arabia with its forces. Saudi Arabia is the site of the holy places of Muslims, Mecca and Medina. There had never been foreign troops there. In 1990, during the Gulf War, they went in the name of helping Saudi Arabia defeat Saddam Hussein. Osama bin Laden remained quiet. Saddam was defeated, but the American troops stayed on. He wrote letter after letter saying, "Why are you here? Get out. You came to help us, but you have stayed on." Finally, he started a jihad against the other occupiers. His mission is to get American troops out of Saudi Arabia. His earlier mission was to get Russian troops out of Afghanistan. See what I was saying earlier about covert operations. This is still Iqbal. A second point to be made about him, about Osama, is these are tribal people. The tribal code of ethics consists of two words, loyalty and revenge. You are my friend, you keep your word, I am loyal to you. You break your word, I go on my path of revenge. For him, America had broken its word. The loyal friend had betrayed. The one to whom you swore blood loyalty has betrayed you. They're going to go for you. They're going to do a lot more. These are the chickens of the Afghanistan war coming home to roost. This is why I said to stop covert operations. There is a price attached to them that the American people cannot calculate, and that people like Kissinger do not know, do not have the history to know. 3 years before 9/11. Eqbal Ahmad was telling us several things here. Very obviously, he was trying to warn us that the cold-blooded operatives like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and their ilk, who were spawned in the breeding grounds of US-sponsored covert operations in Afghanistan, were about to turn their evil attentions to the United States. And of course, they did just that on 9/11 and have been doing so since. But he was also warning us that covert operations always have unintended consequences, that we as citizens cannot generally know this, and that even the likes of Henry Kissinger, highly educated, articulate, a historian, a scholar, his first book was on the Congress of Vienna in 1815, even people like Kissinger do not have the necessary deep historical understanding to comprehend such things. As a result, we have witnessed the repeated disastrous descents of the United States into the moral morass of covert operations, terror, and drugs, whether in Southeast Asia, whether in Central America, or in Afghanistan in the past, and we see the same thing today. It's going on even as we speak in Iran. We are carrying out covert operations inside Iran, from Iraq, from Pakistani bases, from Central Asia, and it's probably going on in other places. In 1998, in the same year as the speech that I quoted to you from, Eqbal Ahmad was quoted in a published article as saying that Osama bin Laden is a sign of things to come. He was queried about this pronouncement in an interview, and he amplified it as follows. And I'm quoting him again. The United States has sowed in the Middle East and South Asia very poisonous seeds. These seeds are growing now. Some have ripened, others are ripening. An examination of why they were sown, what has grown, and how they should be reaped is needed. Missiles won't solve the problem. Would that someone in Washington had been listening then or in the intervening decade. Many of the problems created by US policy, whether in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, might have been prevented. Even today, it is not too late to examine this history, and since these poisonous seeds are still sprouting. This brings me to Iraq, a very painful subject for me, a tragic open wound that I'm sure would have pained Eqbal Ahmad deeply. For he would have seen not only the geopolitics, not only the strategy, not only the cruel, blind stupidity of Arab leaders like Saddam Hussein, and the ahistorical myopia and arrogance of American policy makers. He would have seen these things, I'm sure. But he would also have seen the human tragedy of the systematic destruction of an entire, large, cohesive society. First, through the criminal folly of its tyrannical leaders, who dragged their country into 2 illegal wars of aggression against their neighbors, first Iran, then Kuwait. Then, through the criminal sanctions regime, about which in fact Iqbal wrote, that killed hundreds of thousands of vulnerable Iraqi women, children, sick people, old people, and finally through 4.5 years of American occupation. Iraq has been destroyed as a cohesive society. It may recover, but as of today, that is what one has to say about it. He would have seen that this occupation in particular has destroyed what remained of the Iraqi state, one of the only things that held that country together. I'm told Iraq is an artificial country. Yeah, so are about 150 countries on the face of the earth. They didn't exist 50, 60 years ago. Iraq existed in 1932. It's exactly as artificial as 3/4 of the members of the United Nations. And it is, like many countries, like many nations, like many nationalisms, the creation of a state. It's a very common phenomenon. Read about the French state, read about the Spanish state. Go back 300 or 400 years, not 90 years, and you'll see more or less the same process. Of course, Iraq is an artificial entity. They all are artificial entities. And one of the things that held that country together was the Iraqi state. We have destroyed that. We have done so through allowing a few days of orgiastic looting that destroyed the entirety of the records, the archives, and the offices built up by the Iraqi people over many generations, under the Ottomans, under the British, and since independence, not just under Saddam. Everything was destroyed. The entire Iraqi National Archives was destroyed. Every single document in that archive, every single document was burnt to a crisp. Nothing survived. The historical record of the Iraqi state was destroyed, as was the record of every single ministry, as were the census records, as was everything that gave Iraq cohesion as a state. Destroyed, firstly, through this orgiastic looting that the American occupation did nothing to stop, except for one ministry, the oil ministry, protected by tanks and Marines, of course. It was destroyed as well through the misguided decisions of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was run directly on a telephone line from the top level of the Pentagon. These were decisions to do two things: to de-Ba'athify the government, which, given how Iraqi society had been organized for 3 decades, meant dismantling the government, and secondly, a decision to dissolve the army and the security forces. Eqbal would have seen all of these things, as they can be seen, I think, by anyone who is not completely insensitive morally and who is not deceived by the packaged ignorance that emanates from the TV screen. But he also would have seen other things in Iraq. He would have seen the destruction of a highly cultured, urbane, tolerant urban society in Baghdad, a place where more books were sold and read than anywhere else in the Arab world. It was also a place where there was a deep conscious pride in a direct link back to the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate, who founded the city over 1,200 years ago. At that time, it became the most splendid capital of human achievement, perhaps the most splendid capital of human achievement on earth. A refuge for great thinkers, writers, and scientists of all religions, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, writing in Arabic, which was the lingua franca of its age, the equivalent then of what English is today. He would have been bitter about seeing all of this shattered by a military machine using weapons that were originally designed to fight the Red Army on the plains of Northern Europe, and by the hubris and political obtuseness of a smug, arrogant political class in Washington that compares very poorly to the Bourbons, of whom it was famously said that they forgot nothing and learned nothing. And this is an insult to the Bourbons to compare the lot we have in Washington with them. More than this deeply humane man would have felt the pain of 4 to 6 million Iraqis who have been driven out of their country or displaced within it. That amounts to from 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 of the country's entire population. Putting it in American terms, with our population of 300 million, that would be between 50 and 75 million people forced to flee their homes. Mission accomplished. Eqbal would have seen the destruction not only of a living society, not only the impact of that process on neighboring countries like Syria and Jordan, each of which is struggling with a flood of over 1 million refugees from the war next door. But he also would have been shocked and horrified by the destruction of an unknown part of humanity's patrimony that has been taking place in Iraq without any real reporting of it. I'm speaking of the unrestricted looting for 4 years now of artifacts stolen from sites never yet explored by archaeologists, and which will now be completely mute to their investigation and to their revelations about our origins as civilized urban beings. I would remind you, there are people who say, there's nothing in Iraq, we came to teach them. I would remind you that much of what makes us more than mute beasts, that is to say, writing, agriculture, law, urban life, states, cities, all of these things began many millennia ago in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. The evidence for all of this, for law, for writing, for civilization, lies under what they call tells, little hills, thousands of them, that dot the Syrian and Iraqi landscape and conceal the sites of level upon level of urban life, going back, as we now know from excavations in some of them in Syria, as much as 8,000 years. There were cities there 8,000 years ago. These tells are being ripped apart, and the dozens of levels from which archaeologists and epigraphers and historians date everything, and from which they could have deduced innumerable things about the past of the entirety of humanity, these things are being desecrated by organized armed gangs. These gangs are not wild men. These gangs are linked directly to the super wealthy first world collectors of valuable artifacts whose unrestrained greed and selfishness fuel this barbaric rape of our common heritage as human beings. There are tells in Iraq and especially in Syria where there's still work going on. You can't work obviously in Iraq. There are tells in these countries that have been explored year after year by archaeological expeditions for as much as 80 or 100 years, or sometimes even more. Every year they go back and they find more. And today they are still yielding fresh secrets to trained archaeologists. My daughter is an archaeologist. She spent much of the last decade in Syria and in Yemen, and she's worked on one of these sites. And every year they learn more. Sites that were worked on in the 30s are yielding new secrets in 2007. Those of these sites that have been vandalized in this way by thieves in Iraq will remain forever mute. And part of what we might have learned about ourselves as human beings is gone forever. Like the ancient manuscripts and the Ottoman and British and Iraqi records in the Iraqi National Library and the archives that were burned to ashes in the looting following the occupation, some things are gone forever. This is reminiscent, and I'm sure that Iqbal would have said this if he were with us, this is reminiscent of the sack of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongol conqueror Hulagu, which the Muslim historians tell us led to the Tigris flowing red with the blood of those slaughtered and black with the ashes of the burned books. This legacy of barbarism, of savagery, one of the many results of this evil war, would have been a terrible blow to Iqbal, with his exquisite humanistic sense of the connection of all of us to a single complex human heritage. He would have spoken out, I am sure, not only against the epic folly that brought about the geopolitical, the human, and the archaeological disaster underway in Iraq today, but also about the way this conflict is being used to reify and distort concepts like sect and tribe. If you have the misfortune to be exposed to television, you would have heard about sects and tribes in Iraq. We are told by the talking head instant experts, most of whom could not find their way from the airport to the Hilton in Baghdad without a minder, and none of whom dare go there today because it's so dangerous. We are told by these people that this country is sharply divided along sectarian and national lines. Surely on TV you've heard the mindless babble about the Sunnis and the Shia and the Kurds. And surely you've heard about how the Sunnis are organized into tribes that American forces were fighting against in places like Anbar province, and where they are now trying to co-opt them. Surely you've heard that these are age-old divisions, millennial hatreds. No one, of course, tells you that huge numbers of Iraqis, literally millions of Iraqis, are the children of marriages between Sunnis and Shia, or between Arabs and Kurds. I mean, if we're talking about impermeable groups, how come there are millions of people who are the children of intermarriage between Sunnis and Shia and Arabs and Kurds? If there are three little boxes completely separate from one another, who've been cutting one another's throats for millennia, how come they were marrying each other and having children for so many generations? Something is wrong, obviously, with this picture. Nobody tells you that millions of them live together in the same neighborhoods, in Baghdad, in Basra, in Mosul, the major cities where most Iraqis live. No one tells you that about 75% of Iraq's population is urban, and that tribalism, so-called, was in part the construction of the British in the 1920s, who in Iraq and Jordan went about with suitcases full of gold sovereigns to find tribal chiefs whose authority they could bolster and then use as props for their authority. Of course, the British were simply doing as the Ottomans had done before them. And you are unlikely to have heard that Saddam Hussein himself was reduced to the same means of bribing the tribes at the end of his despicable regime as its power and legitimacy collapsed under the weight of his own criminal actions and sanctions imposed on the country, and as Iraqi society itself began to collapse. And probably no one tells you that American military forces and political intelligence operatives are today doing the very same thing, plying the same kinds of robed characters as were importuned by Ottoman pashas, by Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell, and later by Saddam. Of course, today it's being done with suitcases of shrink-wrapped bundles of fresh dollars taken out of our pockets, the pockets of American taxpayers. But otherwise, it's the same thing. These are the kinds of things that Iqbal might have told us, were he still here to observe with us the ongoing, unending, bloody train wreck that is Iraq today. This brings me to Palestine. This was one of the great issues on which Iqbal Ahmad was eloquent and consistent from very early on. From the first time I've read anything that he's written or said about this, he understood that for all of its specificity, Palestine constituted yet another colonial tragedy, like so many he had experienced and studied. He understood that. At the same time, he also understood that Palestine represented a cruel intersection between that colonial tragedy and the arc of Jewish persecution and suffering in Europe that culminated in the Holocaust. In all of his writings and speeches, in everything I've ever heard him say, or I've ever read of his, a large proportion of which touched on this issue, he was always unambiguous and clear about these things, and also about where the responsibility for the carnage in Palestine lay. Unlike some who refused to look inward, he refused to blame everything on British machinations or Zionist actions or American policy. Like Edward Said, he was deeply self-critical of the Palestinian and Arab leaderships who helped bring their peoples to the catastrophic situation in which they found themselves at the end of the 20th century when he passed away, and in which they still are today, early in the 21st. Not that Iqbal Ahmad ever hesitated to call a spade where colonialism or imperialism were concerned. Long before people stopped being ashamed to call the United States an imperial power, long before Neil Ferguson and other respectable advocates of the United States shouldering its imperial vocation had added their voices to the nakedly imperial calls coming out of the crass neocons in Washington in those dens of iniquity that are quaintly called think tanks. Long before this epiphany in the halls of power, this realization that America is an imperial power after all, Iqbal Ahmad showed no compunction whatsoever in talking and writing about American imperialism as an heir to British colonialism. He wrote specifically, insofar as Palestine is concerned, about the appalling effects of the American policy of opposing Palestinian national rights for so long, of the nefarious impact of the bias of American policy in favor of Israel, and linked all of this to decades-old strategies for external control and domination of the Middle East because of its oil resources and strategic position. And he could be withering in talking of the awful damage done to Palestinian society, and in a very different way to Israel itself by its policies of occupation and settlement since 1967, as well as by the earlier tragedies resulting from the expulsion of over half the Arab population of Palestine in order to make possible the creation of a Jewish state in 3/4 of a country which had a 2/3 Arab majority in 1948. But Iqbal went far beyond these positions, little reflected though they were in a mainstream media which, as he said in the case of the New York Times, had not one foreign affairs columnist who could, quote, comprehend the aspirations, the needs, the feelings of the Arab or Palestinian people. In fact, his most devastating critiques were generally reserved for the Palestinian leadership itself, about whom he probably had a better sense than virtually any scholar or journalist who has written on this topic. This was a result of his many meetings with them and it was a result of his vast experience with other such nationalist elites in post-colonial situations. Iqbal saw right through the hollow pretense of armed struggle that was ardently espoused by Palestinian resistance groups in the 1960s and 70s. Coming from Algeria, where he had worked for the FLN, and where armed struggle appeared to have succeeded, and speaking back in the 60s and 70s at a time when armed struggle was actually winning in Indochina, he understood and criticized both the profoundly flawed way in which the Palestinians were carrying out this strategy and why this strategy was so inappropriate and even counterproductive in their specific case. He later described a speech he gave to a group of PLO supporters in 1969. I'm quoting Iqbal in an interview he gave describing a speech he had earlier given. And he's talking about what he had said back in '69. I argued, this is Iqbal, I argued that armed struggle was supremely unsuited to the Palestinian condition, that it was a mistake to put so much emphasis on it. I argued that armed struggle is less about arms and more about organization, that a successful armed struggle proceeds to out-administer the adversary and not out-fight him, and that the task of out-administration occurs when you identify the primary contradiction of your adversary and expose that contradiction to the world at large and, more importantly, to the people of the adversarial country itself. I argued, this is still Iqbal, I argued that Israel's primary contradiction was that it was founded as a symbol of the suffering of humanity at the expense of another people who were innocent of guilt. It's this contradiction you have to bring out, and you don't bring it out by armed struggle. In fact, you suppress this contradiction by armed struggle. The Israeli Zionist organizations continue to portray Jews as victims of Arab violence. This was Iqbal. In the same interview, he describes how disappointed young Palestinian cadres and intellectuals were to hear him preach the absolute necessity of Palestinians shifting to a nonviolent struggle and to an appeal to the better forces in Israel and in the United States. This was, mind you, in Beirut, in the late 60s and 70s, at the very height of Palestinian revolutionary romanticism, long before the crushing defeats of 1982 and afterwards ended this entire phase, long before, in other words, the PLO gave up armed struggle. Perhaps mercifully, Eqbal Ahmad did not live to see the terrible tragedy of the Second Intifada with its suicide bombings and with the monstrous Israeli reprisals against an entire people that these suicide bombings triggered. This is a repression that is still ongoing and that is animated by the spirit of the Israeli Chief of Staff back in 2002, General Moshe Ya'alon, who justified the ongoing collective punishment, mind you, of an entire people, 3.5 million people, by saying, and I quote, "The Palestinians must be made to understand in the depths of their consciousness that they are a defeated people." That's General Ya'alon in 2002. In his writings, even though he didn't live to see this horrible phase, starting with the year 2000, in his writings, Iqbal perfectly described the self-defeating dynamic produced by earlier examples of Palestinian armed struggle. And these lessons that he left us with were perfectly applicable to the Second Intifada, which started at the end of the year 2000. It solidly unified Israeli society and its political class, and it pushed it far to the right, even as it invited and served to justify ferocious repression of the Palestinians and further carving up of the West Bank into Bantustans and what really amount to open-air prisons. I have relatives in Nablus who have not left that city for 6 years. It's a city of 200,000 people. The majority of that population cannot leave. That's prison. And that's what that repression has amounted to. Iqbal understood, wrote about, and fiercely criticized this dynamic within Palestinian politics long before the Second Intifada sadly proved him right. I can barely imagine what words Iqbal would have had for the present Palestinian leadership, which has managed to succeed in completely dividing the Palestinians, who were already far weaker than their foes, both politically dividing them and geographically dividing them. I can only imagine what he would have said. We have many published examples of his sharp critiques of Yasser Arafat, whom Iqbal met many times, and whom he tried repeatedly to persuade to change his strategy. He would have been even more scathing in describing the failings of a Fatah leadership that has still not broken with the legacy of corruption, patronage, bureaucratic incompetence, and weakness in dealing with Israel that was left to it by Arafat. He would have been even more scathing in describing a Hamas leadership that cynically exploits both violence and Islam, even as it benefits from a now fraying reputation for resistance to compromise, for incorruptibility, and for serving the people. He would have understood, I'm sure, that even the tragedies of a colonial past, and the Palestinian tragedy is extraordinary. It is a particularly awful colonial past. I write about it in my book, The Iron Cage. He would have understood that these tragedies do not justify some forms of self-indulgence and self-pity, and that it is necessary to take a certain degree of responsibility and assume agency even in the most difficult circumstances. Let me conclude. I've gone on for a while. Let me conclude by asking what Eqbal Ahmad might have said about what may be our next war, the one with Iran. Eqbal Ahmad understood history better than many fine historians. I'm a historian myself, and I can attest to that fact. He understood that the key to the Iranian-American relationship lay in history. In general, this was Iran's history of being pushed around by Western powers for a couple of centuries. And specifically, this was a history with the United States since the Anglo-American coup of 1953 that ended democracy in Iran and installed a stooge as Shah. It was also the American history with Iran from the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 and the hostage crisis that followed it and that so poisoned American views of Iran. Eqbal knew and wrote and spoke about the fact that everything between America and Iran flowed from these historical antecedents and from the Iranian regime's insistence after the revolution on independence from a Washington that was and is determined to control this part of the world. He would not, therefore, have been terribly surprised by the collision course that these two powers are currently on, nor by the Cold War that has enveloped the Middle East between them, and which was going to be the topic of my talk today, nor by the possibility that this might become a hot war at any time. Very few things, in fact, surprised Eqbal Ahmad, I think it should be said. But having lived through and having participated actively in the civil rights movement of the 1960s in this country and in the anti-war movement of the 1960s and 70s, he would have railed against our passivity in the face of these current wars and against the prospect, and in the face of the prospect of a new one. I share his moral outrage at our passivity, all of us, in the face of these current and looming crises, if I cannot say that I share his learning and his sagacity. I can only conclude by saying to all of you that we have the opportunity to go back and learn from Eqbal, whose writings, fortunately, are now readily available to us in book form and online. I found a number of his speeches like that through Google. And we all have a responsibility to do better, much better than we have so far, in confronting some of the challenges presented by a world whose lineaments Eqbal Ahmad clearly saw. That would be the ultimate gesture of respect for this wonderfully generous and warm-spirited man who could not remain silent in the face of wrongdoing and the foolish illusions of the powerful, whether in Washington, Rawalpindi, Tel Aviv, or Ramallah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions if people want to use the microphone in the center of the floor.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. There's a little detail earlier in your speech when you were speaking about 9/11 having been perpetrated by an Osama bin Laden that was kind of hell-bent on revenge. for the covert operations in the Middle East. But there's a
In
growing,
Afghanistan, actually.
in Afghanistan. But there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that the events that transpired on 9/11 might have been exactly the opposite. Maybe it was an inside job that has in turn scapegoated Islam, Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, spilling over into strategic resource control wars that are now possibly spilling over into Iran. And, obviously benefiting a select few corporations and really powerful elite. So with that in mind, I feel like a bit of your story doesn't quite add up, especially since some of the research there is coming out of professors, Brigham Young publishing peer-reviewed literature suggesting incendiary devices being used in the taking down of the trade towers. And I know that's kind of controversial for some people to hear, but could you maybe shed a little light in that area, that little detail?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to answer each question. I won't take questions, several questions at a time, which I usually do, because I may forget the earlier questions. My son is a believer in this theory, and I've read some of the Griffith books and other books on it. I am unfortunately thoroughly unconvinced. I am a historian. I read about why things happen in the past, where we actually have some evidence. And things happen in strange ways for reasons that sometimes seem peculiar. I'm not saying this is outside the realm of probability or possibility. It's conceivable to me. But I am myself personally convinced that this group did carry out this attack. There may well have been more than simply incompetence and bad serendipity in the fact that plane after plane after plane after plane was allowed to plow into building after building after building. But I do actually believe that the people who said they did this, did this. That it has been used, as you say, is unquestionable. But I myself am unconvinced by this theory.
I just want to thank you and say that I think the analysis you gave was a very powerful one, and one that has a very long historical span and a wide global viewpoint. But I want to comment on the way that you ended, which was to say with Eqbal, we need to do better, which I certainly couldn't agree with more. And so I'm wondering, given that the way that better gets done is not just through each of us individually, deciding to do better, although that's certainly an important part of it, but through some sort of collective action and movements that point in a positive as opposed to a negative direction. It's not that you can make, I assume, a broad general statement about that, because the positive forces in each particular place and each particular situation are different. But sort of giving you your choice, I guess, of where you would like to focus, I wonder if you could comment on some of the forces that you would look to, or that we could look to, that are, like you say, in the Palestinian situation, for instance, the problems with the US position, the problems with the Israeli position, the problems with the governmental forces in both Hamas and Fatah. So where does one look for the signs of hope?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think our focus in this country should be on the war that we're fighting in Iraq. I think that is the key, not just to our own domestic situation. I don't think we'll ever have trains that are worth anything in this country, or hospitals, or public housing, or public education, or child care, unless we can derail the $600 billion that go to war. I just don't think we can do it. It's physically impossible. And they need these wars. The metal, what in the Soviet system used to be called the metal eaters, the heavy industries that produce weapons. They need these wars. We have to not just stop this war, we have to go from that to a systemic understanding of how that is linked to mispriorities within our society. So I would argue that as Americans, that's what we have to start. How we do that, I don't know. If I were a politician, I could give you I'm not a politician. I'm a historian. I analyze the past, I try and explain the present, and I can't predict the future. But I can see that that's the key. And insofar as American Middle East policy is concerned, if there is going to be change, it will come from a reversal of this intrusive, invasive pattern of intervention, which has given us Iraq and Afghanistan and many other things, but also has our fingers up to the eyeballs of the Palestinians and the Israelis and everybody else. We are the major player in the Palestinian-Israeli, Arab-Israeli conflict right now. If we can turn the Iraq thing around, we can begin to think, as Americans, of turning around that aspect of our policy, which contributes massively to the awful situation in Palestine today. Finally, the rest of it is up to the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Arabs. I mean, we can go only so far, or the Pakistanis, or the Afghans, or whoever. We can only go so far. And I could talk to you, for example, about the positive forces in Palestinian society, or the positive forces in Israeli society. But clearly, a great deal has to be done to get us out of, in the Palestinian case, to move things from the absolutely abysmal state where they are. And I'm not just talking about what has been imposed on them by the Israelis with the assistance and aid of this country to our eternal discredit. I'm talking about the mess that the Palestinians are in, the mess that the Palestinian leadership, what seems to me to be the collapse of the whole phase of the Palestinian national movement going back to the 1950s and 60s. It seems to me to be pretty much at an end, which may in fact end up being a good thing in the long run. But the people who are alive today don't have the long run to look to. So there are actually positive forces there. I could talk about that if you want. But insofar as we're not in Ramallah or Khan Yunis, we're in Amherst, Massachusetts. I think it is incumbent upon us as Americans to do something about our role in all of this. And we have an enormous role in Palestine. We have an enormous role in Iraq. And we have an enormous role in in Pakistan and Afghanistan and the other crises I talked about. And if we make war on Iran, God help us. We will be in such a bad situation for so very long that if you have stock in arms companies, your future is assured. But otherwise, God help us.
Hi. My question is, from my perspective as an activist on this campus, on a group called Students for Justice in Palestine, and I want to ask you either what you want to say in the voice of Eqbal Ahmad or of yourself about question that we deal with today in our group, an internal discussion. What kind of stand should we take on the Annapolis Peace Summit that some people here might know or might not know that is about to take place with...
Let me answer you.
Yeah.
The question is, what position should we take on the Annapolis Summit? Think of the Annapolis Summit as a brief summer storm. It will pass. It will have no effect. It may knock down the odd cherry tree. It may, break a window with some hail. It will have no effect. I mean, think systematically. Is the United States committed to ending the Israeli occupation? No. Is the Israeli government committed to ending Israeli occupation? No. Is the Palestinian leadership unified? No. What is going to bring about a resolution of this conflict, or anything but more wallpaper put over cracks at Annapolis? I think that what you should be thinking about is more basic issues. How, and by this I don't mean one state, two states. How do we get out of the state we're in? That's the real issue. A resolution of this conflict is not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen one day. And we have to budge things from the point of immobility, or the point of regression that we're at now. And that, I think, is how we should be thinking. And I actually don't think we have to worry very much about this lame duck administration's policy of malign neglect of Palestine much longer. They can barely walk and chew gum at the same time, these guys. And they're thinking, such as their thought process is, it's pretty much devoted to Iraq. They're not paying a whole lot of attention to this issue. I would guess that the engagement of the president and the vice president in this issue amounts to maybe 0.25% of their time. And the Secretary of State may be going and coming, but look at American policy in the Middle East. The times that it has actually affected change, whether for good or for ill, it's been when a president has really been actively engaged. President Truman was actively engaged in 48. Result, not so good, but actively engaged. 1956, President Eisenhower was actively engaged. Result, end of the Suez War. And you could go through Kissinger and Nixon, you could go through First President Bush and Baker, you could go through the miserable experience of President Clinton, But such as it is, American involvement is dependent on a president and a secretary of state, both of them putting their shoulder to whatever wheel it may be. And that's not going to happen here, so don't worry about it. Annapolis is just a passing summer squall.
If I may ask, just kind of to refine my question, I'm a little bit puzzled because you're talking about the influence of either the long run but you didn't refer to what's going to happen or what are the possibilities that of what might happen to the Palestinian people as a result of this summit. And I'm kind of afraid
As a result of this summit?
Yeah, and I'm kind of more afraid of the option of, this Abu Mazen guy trying to sell his land or whatever. I don't know if you want to refer to that, and there's another.
I wouldn't worry overly about it.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
you should limit it to one question a person. We have about 10 minutes left for questions.
So I'm also a member of this group, Students for Justice in Palestine, and we talk about the struggle for a Palestinian state. You talk about this in your book. And the struggle for a Palestinian state, this means cultivating a Palestinian nationalism. And nationalism has played a historical role all over the world in fighting colonialism. You talked about the FLN. But in many of these cases, after the independence won from this nationalism, this nationalism morphs into an authoritarian form.
Right.
And so my question is, if you see a way for a Palestinian, or possibly for Palestinian liberation outside of a state, or at the least preventing a liberationist nationalism from turning into an authoritarian nationalism?
That's a good question. Actually, one of the wisest people about this was Eqbal Ahmad, who in this book, in his writings, talks at length in different places about witnessing the very process you're talking about, a nationalist liberation movement turning into an authoritarian, awful state. It is a problem that has been repeated so many times in so many post-colonial cases that we should know that it's an enormously likely possibility. I watched it happen with the PLO, and it has since happened with the PA. So you have a situation without sovereignty, without statehood, without independence, without jurisdiction, without control. You have all of the ills of a post-independence situation. In other words, you have the worst of all possible worlds in the Palestinian case. So we know that, we can see it because we see those structures before us. As I suggest in the book, I assume you're referring to the iron cage. I think that what Palestinians have to do is to think, as it were, outside the box. They have to understand the situation, we have to understand the situation we're in, which is a situation where there is one state right now in Palestine, Israel. It is the single state, the single sovereign authority, the single army, the single security agency between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. How do you deal with that situation? Now, it may be you deal with it by trying to end the occupation of part of Palestine and erecting a state. It might be that that is impossible. It might be that the efforts that have been made to make the occupation and annexation of most of the West Bank irreversible are irreversible. It may be that that's not the case, but that's where the analysis has to start. And by thinking outside the box, I mean thinking about not only how to avoid the pitfall that you talk about, but how you do what Eqbal said in this quote, which is to speak to the adversary. Because you're not going to win if you unify the Israelis. The closest the Palestinians came to liberation was in a very short period between 1987 and 1991, when an overwhelming majority of Israelis were persuaded by the first Intifada that the occupation was not sustainable and that the settlement enterprise would not work, and that maybe the Palestinians, if they didn't have a case, were too much of a pain in the neck to continue to hold down. Okay? And they did not do this by blowing up Israelis. Such casualties as there were occurred entirely in the occupied territories and were overwhelmingly among Palestinians. It was not nonviolent, and in fact, Eqbal is critical of it, because it was not nonviolent. But if you look at its impact on Israeli society and where it put the Palestinians, you can obviously see an important lesson, which he was trying to teach from the 60s. So at the end of the 80s, we had an illustration of what he was saying, and then in 2000, we had an even more bloody, miserable, obvious illustration of what he's saying. And in fact, I would argue that's where we should start looking. And that's, of course, it may be argued a matter of tactics, but it's not. It's actually a matter of strategy. Beyond that, I mean, I can't say. How do you predict the future? I don't know.
Thank you.
Hi. You started out your lecture talking about Ahmed's unique characteristic of being a worldly citizen, of having that worldly experience. And then in a previous question, you talked about America has a vested interest in these international issues. Specifically, what's the role of intellectual communities in the 21st century in these issues, and such as the Pakistan crisis?
Well, I mean, intellectuals, read Edward Said's book, wonderful book, on the role of the intellectual, and I think you get probably the most intelligent answer you're going to get. To
Cornel West as well.
Cornel West is another person who's written about this quite eloquently. I mean, look at Pakistan today. Who is it who actually put sand in the cogs of this awful dictatorship? Was it Benazir Bhutto, sitting in gilded exile in the Gulf, between the Gulf and London and Washington, wherever she exiles herself? Was it Nawaz Sharif? It wasn't. It was lawyers. It was the Chief Justice. Those were the people that brought this entire machine to a screeching halt. And what are lawyers, if not, intellectuals of a sort? I mean, we have a particularly jaundiced view of lawyers in this country. But, sometimes lawyers are good people. And here is an instance. My daughter's a law student. I can say anything I want about lawyers. And here is an instance where public intellectuals of a sort played an absolutely crucial role, as are students playing in Pakistan today, as are others. If you read, again, I was reading some of Iqbal's stuff in preparation of this, and he talks about the forces in Pakistani civil society, which are the positive forces. It's almost entirely these kinds of groups and forces that are the only real hope for change, that the only people who can push the opposition parties, should democracy be restored, to be more than corrupt vehicles for self-enrichment or stooges for foreign powers, and who have been the only people who have actually managed to stand up to this awful dictatorship. So, it's obviously a different answer in different circumstances. Sometimes intellectuals are co-opted. The treason of the trahison des clercs, the treason of the intellectuals, is a constant problem. It's easy to be bought off, and intellectuals are no more immune to that than anyone else, obviously. But in each case, I would say they obviously play a very different role. In this country, they play a very important role. Look at the way in which public opinion has turned against the Iraq War. We were, all of us, subject to the most nauseating intoxication since Goebbels walked the face of the earth, through the media, in the lead up to the Iraq War. It made Pravda and Izvestia look like, children's highlights or some kind of kiddie literature. It was the most sophisticated propaganda in the history of humanity, run by dedicated, competent political operatives, people like Roger Ailes, one of the core intellectuals of the modern Republican Party, the president, the chairman of Fox News, that major organ of the Republican Party, and the leader of cable news. It has more viewers than any other cable network. In spite of that, public opinion turned against the war in Iraq within 1 year and 3 months. Now, why did that happen? Were we being shown the truth on television? We see nothing absolutely nothing. You can see blonde girls disappearing in the Bahamas and whatever has done with whoever and her weight loss program, but you cannot see news. You cannot see what's happening in Iraq. Did we read it in the press? No, the press followed this change. It was, I would argue, people reading on the internet, seeing alternative sources of information, and the same kind of sand in the grains of sand in the wheels of the machine. There's virtually no real organized, powerful anti-war movement. There's a series of anti-war coalitions around the country. And yet, I would argue, essentially through the appeal of those kinds of people to the basic good sense and common sense of the American people, they were turned around from support of this war to opposition to it in 15 months. So, in each situation, the role is different.
Maybe we can take 2 more quick questions.
Do you believe that state sponsorship of terrorism by the Iranian government, or Syria, or any of America's other strategic rivals in the Middle East is actually still a threat to American national security? Or would you characterize this as an unfounded anachronism of the Cold War?
State sponsorship of terrorism is a constant problem. It's a constant problem from every country. It's mainly a problem for small, weak countries. So whatever is going on in Iranian Baluchistan today, in Iranian Kurdistan today, in other places where a terrorist group based in Iraq is carrying out attacks inside Iran, is a problem for the Iranians, as is whatever the Iranians are sponsoring in response to this or triggering this in other places. But I think that we have to look very carefully, as Iqbal did in a wonderful speech called "Their Terrorism and Ours," at the various kinds of terrorism. And he categorizes it under 5 rubrics, the most important of which is state terrorism. And he is obviously not blind to the fact that states like Iran or Syria or whatever carry out such terrorism, but he is mainly focused, as he should be given the budget of some of the agencies that do this from our side, on our terrorism. And I think that I can only go back to what he said. Always, invariably, this has unintended consequences. Always it's linked to drugs. The drug smuggling out of Afghanistan through Iran is the source, and through Pakistan, is the source of the addiction of millions of people in that region, and the source of most of the drugs that reach certain parts of Europe and to some extent the United States. This is necessary, inevitable, always goes with what we do in terms of covert operations. It happened in Southeast Asia, it happened in Central America, it's happening there now. So it's not just the terrorism, it's the destruction of the lives through the drugs that always go with the terrorism. And I'm talking about covert operations terrorism. The same thing is happening in the other direction. It's not just us in Afghanistan. It's the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's not just the thugs that we're sponsoring. It's the Iranian regime as well that is doing the same kind of thing. You have to address the whole problem. And I think that our intervention in this region, our overwhelmingly powerful covert and overt intervention in this region, is something that the American people really have to re-examine carefully. What possible interest do we have in fighting in these countries? What possible interest do we have in alienating people as we have? As I say in an earlier book, Resurrecting Empire, this country was enormously popular in the Middle East until relatively recently. They do actually like our freedom. They do actually like our economic system. They actually like many aspects of our culture. They just don't like our foreign policy. They don't like our bases. They don't like our support of corrupt, repressive elites in these countries. I think we have to rethink that whole approach. And I shudder when I watch the presidential candidates and how little deviation there is from the mindless consensus that prevails in Washington today on these subjects. I think the next one is the last one. I'm sorry, there's just one more question.
This is about the state of emergency in Pakistan. I was wondering,
Pull the mic down so I can hear you.
one of the most disturbing things about a state of emergency is that it's not necessarily temporary. Like if you look at a country like Egypt, there's been a state of emergency since 1981.
Right.
And this is my opinion. I feel like one of the reasons why that happens is because the US supports such regimes. And although Pakistani civil society is really mobilizing, it seems that it might not be enough to end a state of emergency.
Right.
What sort of policy change do you think the US should have to
Well, let me give you a concrete piece of advice. This is the kind of thing you could actually mobilize around in this country. And this country can help affect that change. It has to be Pakistani civil society that does the heavy lifting. But go back and think of what happened in South Africa. This country, under Reagan, was crucial to the maintenance and power of an apartheid regime. Were it not for mobilization in this country, a right-wing Republican administration that loved apartheid, that had won an election on a states' rights platform. Ronald Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi and said, I believe in states' rights, at the place where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered. Thank you. Had just been murdered. This administration that was running this country had come to power on a lynching platform. They loved apartheid. They had been elected on an apartheid southern states strategy. And yet we turned that around. And we turned it around because people in this country organized around apartheid, demonstrated outside the South African embassy, changed public opinion on the issue, such that even the Republicans, states' rights, segregationist, white-sheeted Ku Klux Klan Republicans who loved apartheid were forced to change. It wasn't they changed their views, they changed their policy. These people love Musharraf. I mean, go across the spectrum from right to left, Democrat to Republican. They'll say, we want stability, the nuclear weapons, our policy in Afghanistan. We have to have a general in power. They always say that. But we can speak to that. We should favor an end of the state of emergency as people, as citizens. I mean, this is something you can mobilize around. You can't mobilize around Egypt today. There's no dramatic event that you can get people sitting on their couches in Keokuk and Portland, Maine, But they're watching Pakistan now. This is a moment that actually represents a possibility of change. As they were watching South Africa at a certain moment, they're watching Pakistan now. So that would be my advice. I mean, let the Pakistanis do what the Pakistanis have to do, but we have to do something because we are the two props that hold this decaying, collapsing military dictatorship up.